Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar titled A Better Way to Integrate SharePoint and Excel with SAP. Our webinar should run approximately 1 hour, and we will be highlighting the features and the functionality of the Winshuttle product in SAP and SharePoint. My name is Teresa Chaki, and I'm with Adaptive Corporation. And our primary focus is to help companies enable business users to radically accelerate SAP user transactions and automate business process improvement to create smarter workflows throughout an organization. Joining us today from Winshuttle is Nick Petty. Nick will be highlighting the key performance indicators of the Winshuttle product and also the value it brings to our customers. Also on the line today we have Bill Wiseman from our Winshuttle Technical Division, who will be going through the features and the functionality of the Winshuttle application. Let's quickly run through the agenda of our webinar today. First, Nick will be talking about the integration of SAP and SharePoint and show examples of use cases. Also, he will review the current integration options. Then Bill will be going through a demonstration of the Winshuttle's forms and workflow, showing the features and also the benefits. We will wrap up with a summary and go through a Q&A session. As a reminder, please use the questions and answer box on your GoToWebinar control panel to ask your questions at any time. We will do our best to answer in real time and get all the Q&A back to all of the attendees following today's presentation, along with the URL of the recording of our webinar and presentation materials. We'll be sending the presentation today to all of our attendees at the end of our webinar. So let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and pass the baton over to Nick Petty from our Winshuttle.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you're located. I hope you're having a wonderful day. My name is Nick Petty, and I'm a Vice President here at Winshuttle. And so the first thing I'd like to talk about is, why integrate SAP and SharePoint. Now, SAP is clearly the system of record for a vast majority of corporate enterprises today. It is the ERP leader in terms of business functionality. It has a proven stable technology that companies use to run their businesses across the globe. It also has built up a large ecosystem of people that can supply, configure, and add to SAP, which is very helpful. It also has a lot of industry solutions. However, with this complexity comes some challenges. The first is that SAP has a complex user interface, and often this leads to challenges for companies getting data into SAP in a timely manner. As a result, this also means the quality and timeliness of data affects the ability to make decisions. SAP also has numerous workflow tools within itself, but they are very difficult and technical to set up and use. And finally, SAP is only used by a minority of employees in an organization. The average is about 20% of all employees in a large organization are SAP license holders. Well, on the other hand, SharePoint is becoming the enterprise portal of choice. In comparison to SAP, it has a simple web-based UI. It has a lot of collaboration tools within it. It's easy to configure, easily supported by IT. It's easy to administrate, and like SAP, has a large ecosystem of third-party vendors to be called upon to help configure and adjust. And unlike SAP, it is normally licensed across an enterprise, so nearly every user across an organization can access a SharePoint site. It's becoming one of the main tools which Gartner describes as business unit application development. So business units working in conjunction with IT can develop solutions and processes and web capabilities so they can organize themselves. So on the downside, SharePoint is not an ERP system. It is not designed as a system of record. And while it does have its own workflow capabilities, that too has its limitations. So if you can bring SAP and SharePoint together and get the best of both worlds, we think there is a huge opportunity to leverage the best components of each of the two systems. For an example, the SharePoint and SAP integration. One of the great things that you can provide users is with a single web-based entry point. You can store that data within your SAP system of record. You can expand the number of participants within a process because more people have access to their web-based interface. You can also get to leverage the large investments that you've already made with SAP and also with Microsoft. And finally, you can improve business processes and make your enterprise more efficient. So what Winshuttle has been doing for a long time is solving these problems of these complex user interfaces within SAP. Historically, what we have done is collapse these complex user interfaces into a single template. So the example that you see on your screen right now is creating a new employee. So creating a new employee in SAP requires a person to go through 25 separate SAP screens. It's the PA40 transaction. So what Winshuttle is able to do is collapse these user interfaces that typically would take a long time to input into a single spreadsheet or a single online form where a user would have access and simply fill out the template, click a button, and all that data would go directly into SAP within a minute or two of filling out this form versus spending 20 minutes going through the multiple SAP screens. Another example would be simplifying complex user interfaces as creating vendors. When you create a new vendor in SAP, you need to go through at least 7 different screens within SAP. We, again, collapse these user interfaces for a single template where a user can easily fill out and click a button and it would go into SAP. So whether you're creating a spreadsheet in Excel that you can enable to update single records or do mass changes, or creating an online form that sits on SharePoint, what we're finding is more and more folks, as they're building a form, it also requires some type of workflow that's attached to it, where a particular manager needs to approve the information before it finally goes into SAP, or another manager needs to add additional data before it goes into SAP. So Winshuttle has a whole group of solutions and products to help not only consolidate and complex these user interfaces, but also manage and create workflow for your particular companies. So some examples of Winshuttle Forms capabilities, can enable like a request for quotation. You see on the left-hand side of the form that the user would fill in, and you see on the right-hand side an image of the designer tool in which forms and workflow is captured. So we have swim lanes with different roles within an organization, and it's fairly easy to build this workflow, as you will see during the demo in just a couple of minutes from now. Another example would be engineering project requests. You can see here the complexity of the forms that you can build using Winshuttle workflow capability. Another example would be employee evaluations. It's a simple workflow. You can see the designer swim lanes, but you can build relatively complex forms with many different user interfaces and choices of how people input data, from simple text fields to radio buttons to grids, and a whole range of complex fields that can be built. The really interesting and nice feature about Winshuttle is its complexity, not its complexity, its flexibility of the solution. When you take a look at our clients that we have, there are some specific use cases that that a lot of our clients fall into these major areas. Within finance, AP, AR posting, journal entries are very popular applications, along with fixed asset creation and maintenance. In the HR, I showed you an example of a new hire, but creating and changing organization and updating benefits information can be challenging, and the solutions that Winshuttle have can help really radically accelerate the way you can update benefits within your SAP system. In operations, purchase orders, sales orders, pricing conditions, plant maintenance, very popular applications. In IT, creating master data, updating master data, data maintenance, again, very popular applications. What's interesting is the Winshuttle software does work within all the SAP modules and just about every single SAP transaction. Although I don't want to really get into the actual products today, I just want to give you a little bit exposure of kind of what you would need in order to deploy a Winshuttle solution. And it's really kind of three components. The one component is build it, and that's like the super user, the authoring licenses. And there's something called the studio licenses that encompasses 4 of our products that you would need in order to build templates. And then once these templates and super users build these templates, then they're deployed within an organization to something called these runner type licenses that can be simply set up on a desktop or set up on a server for deployment of thousands of people. And it's all very secure and controlled through our product called Central. And you can see that the user interface is kind of unique because there's a lot of options that you can use, whether you're dealing with Microsoft Office and if you want to deal with Excel or Access or PDF or SharePoint or mobile or web integration. There's a lot of interfaces that has the capability of interacting with our software. We also get a lot of questions regarding which versions of SharePoint and SAP we support and what are the requirements. So we support the vast majority of SAP versions and SharePoint versions. As we sit on top of the SAP security model, so there is really nothing you can do with Winshuttle that you couldn't do with SAP. It all depends on your user roles and your logs within SAP. So our products are very, very secure. So in summary, I'm going to be turning over to Bill Wiseman in a second. The power of Winshuttle workflow, we empower business users to automate business processes with a very flexible solution. There's a no programming approach to workflow development. There's a very short developmental cycle compared to other alternatives that are out there in the market today. And it's very easy to adopt to the changing business processes that organizations constantly go through. Winshuttle has been around for many years on the SAP world. We currently have over 2,000 customers in over 51 countries. All our products are Microsoft certified and SAP certified. We've been featured in the Gartner, the leading SAP analyst, their cool vendor reports last year. And we have a fantastic customer satisfaction score of 99% that we're very proud of. We're also proud of Adaptive. Adaptive is one of Winshuttle's top value-added resellers, and both are positioned to recommend the solutions to you and also deploy the solutions to you as well. And they've been a good partner of Winshuttle over the many years as well. We're proud to have Adaptive as a partner. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill Wiseman. Hey, Bill, are you out there somewhere?
I am out here.
Good, Bill. Welcome. I'm going to turn it over to you. You can do a quick demo for everyone, and if you have questions, please, as a reminder, put them in the chat panel, and right after Bill's demo, we'll be able to answer those questions.
All right, perfect. So can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can.
All right, excellent. So I appreciate it, Nick. Thanks for the introduction. And so I'm going to show you a demonstration of how the Winshuttle solution works, integrating the SharePoint with SAP via Winshuttle, kind of highlighting the workflow process and how we can really streamline these various business processes. So the nice thing about it is it works across multiple functional areas in SAP. So we have customers that are really applying it in areas of supply chain, logistics, HR. And so today what I thought I would do is show you a couple of end-use examples to begin with, and then walk you through the process of how we can easily build and deploy these forms so that our users can interact with SAP and incorporate that into a workflow process. So I'm going to start out with just showing you an example. In this case, I'm going to call up a material creation. So I'm an end user, and I guess let me back up here just a second just to kind of show you the overview of the portal here. So I'm accessing this via the SharePoint environment. So everything now created Winshuttle resides in this SharePoint site. Within this document library, we have our forms, our data files, our scripts, and really everything we've created Winshuttle. So our user can easily have one central point of access to access any of these forms and scripts and templates and so forth. So it's also a place where we can manage the workflow, and it's also a place where we can manage the governance of how our Winshuttle users are interacting with SAP. So as an end user, and let's say, for instance, I'm a material clerk, I might come in and say, I need to create a new material. And based on my role in this process, I may see a certain set of objects in that MMO1 transaction. As we know, MMO1, 16 screens, hundreds of objects that are populated in various areas of the organization. So we have basic data and sales, plant data, general data, costing, accounting, you name it, and there's different applications or different roles or participants in the creation of a material. And so what I can do is I can take that business process, I can divide it among those participants, and then take their contributions throughout the process, accumulate them, and then finally, as we get to the fruition of the build of the new material, we can post them into SAP. So I'm a material clerk, and I'm just going to start out by, I'll just call this the test material. And then I'm going to make selections based on, what's pertinent to me. And in this case, it's really just, some of the basic data information, the gross weight, the net weight, the weight unit, volume, size dimensions, and so forth. Now in this process, I can also validate the data within the template that I'm submitting to SAP. So we can invoke via Winshuttle a validation function that really checks the data in the form against the SAP business rules to make sure there aren't any errors that exist. In this case, there's not any errors. Once I do that, I might, as a participant, add my comments, and now I want to route it on to the other participants in the process. Now I'm going to select today, as a part of this process, I'm going to select myself as to play all these roles. In actuality, you would probably have this automated. So based on a material type or a material group or a company code or a sales org, something like that might drive the routing of a particular workflow through a group. So I'm just going to save and route my form now. Now I've put the data that was pertinent to me. So it now goes to my manager. Now my manager could easily access this task here, or quite possibly if my manager wasn't close to his desk or he couldn't access the portal, then he might have his email available to him. And then there he could view the form, he could approve or reject this workflow process. If he was attached, he could open the task from the SharePoint site. And in this case, what you're going to see, he's going to get to see the work that the material clerk did. So material clerk has input all this basic data information. We can see that there were no errors found when we did the validation check. The manager might review it and say, okay, I'm going to approve this. Well, here's a graphical representation of this particular workflow that we're going to walk through. So it starts here. It goes to the manager, and that's the state that we're in now. The manager will either reject it and send an email notification back to the originator, or approve it and send it on to sales and accounting simultaneously, collect their data, add it to the form, and finally send it to the master data group. We'll do the final review and approval or rejection and send email notifications to the appropriate persons. The manager approves it in this case and routes it on to sales and accounting simultaneously. Sales and accounting will also only see their view. So the accounting group, they're only going to see what data is pertinent to them. In this case, maybe it's just some pricing information that they need to add. And then they'll route it along. In this case, they're a participant and not an approver. Sales is the same. They'll see what's pertinent to them. In this case, maybe it's transportation group, loading group, maybe selecting the packaging material. And then they'll route it along in the process. Finally, it goes to the master data group for final review and approval. In this case, the master data group sees the entire form. So this is the master data group view. And they see what basic data 1 and 2 did. They see what sales did. They see what accounting did. And once they finally approve that, they can call that web service that Nick mentioned just a minute ago and post this transaction to SAP. So it passes the transaction, it passes the data, it passes the credentials that are associated here with this form to SAP, and it creates a new material in SAP. This approval here at this point could be a one-step process. We have it showing as a two-step process, but we could automatically post based on approval. And then after the completion, we get the complete audit trail around this form. So all this is going to be stored in this database. The forms, if there's any attachments here or documentation that you wanted to add to the form, you could do so. Store that here in this central repository. You see the log file information here, the originator, time, date, stamp, the actions they took. Same for the manager, the accounting department, the sales department, and finally the master data group. So we have a complete audit trail of the transaction that is then stored here in this environment. So that's kind of an end use case example. Now, as Nick mentioned earlier, there's different flavors. There's different ways to deploy SAP or to deploy Winshuttle. And another way to do this, and we can use workflow in the same process, is to do something like a mass creation. So in this case, this data template would be attached to the workflow process as an attachment, and then we would have multiple, maybe hundreds or thousands of records in this template that would then be passed along to SAP, and then ultimately at the fruition of this workflow process, the data would be submitted to SAP and then posted to SAP, and we would be creating multiple records or kind of a mass data load as opposed to the creation of a single record. So you can see different ways of deployment of the Winshuttle solution. We have different ways that our customers are leveraging us, different ways that our solution is deployed. So let's look at now, I've got about 15 minutes, and so let's look now at how we can easily create these these transactions, these forms, and then deploy them to our end user. So the way this is done is simply this. We record a transaction in SAP using Winshuttle and our transaction product. That is, at the end of that, we publish a web service, which is really an HTML link. That web service sits in Central in that SharePoint repository, because you remember I said everything Winshuttle at that point resides in that repository. As an author or a builder, as Nick said, I can take that web service, I can open the designer solution, model a workflow, design a form, publish that integrated workflow form back to that SharePoint environment, and that's exactly what you just saw me do. I was the end user, I went in, I filled out my form, I submitted it along in a workflow process. So let's look at the process of really authoring or building this. So as I said, it starts with basic transaction. So I'm just going to create a simple transaction, and we're going to create a simple form. So we launch transaction, and then we will enter our T code, which is the SAP T code that we choose, into the form. In this case, I'll just enter in here a basic transaction. So let me get back here. Okay, so it's a three-step process of recording, mapping our transaction, which in this case we're going to map it to a form, and we're going to publish a web service. So I'm just going to put in my application here, my T code, my password. The good news is you can't circumvent any of the security of SAP via Winshuttle. So any of the roles, profiles, user authorizations that you've established for your users, we completely adhere to. So you cannot circumvent SAP security via Winshuttle. So I will put in here a description. So basically we're in SAP, we're recording one good transaction, because really that is what is key to creating a transaction. So I'm going to select the view, and what's happening here is it's recording the fields and actions that I'm taking, changes that I'm making. I'll just put in some data. I'll put in a base unit of measure, and it records not only the fields that I touch, but it also records the fields that every field in a screen that I go into. So I went into this screen, all these fields are now recorded. And I'll show you just in a minute the value of that. I'll continue to navigate. We'll just make this pretty simple. So basic data 1 and basic data 2. I'll save my transaction. So the first step of recording is finished. Now what we want to do is we want to map it. And here we have our option. Are we talking about a mass load, or are we talking about a single service form? We're going to ultimately use the form, but I'm going to show you kind of both ways of doing this. And the good news is there's really no difference between the way we record these transactions. I mean, just because we choose a form over an Excel template, it really doesn't matter with regards to, how this transaction is recorded. So there's really nothing different to do. So now that we've recorded it, finalized it, we're ready to create the mapping. And so basically what you see is what you did. I went into these fields, these field descriptions. I keyed in these values. That is exactly what we did in the process. As I told you, it also records not only the fields that we touch, but those that we didn't touch. So let's say, for instance, in this case, I'm going to scroll down here to the screen where we were putting in the detail information about the material. And I'm going to select division. Now I'm going to enable the division object. When I come back to the basic mapping field, I see now division is included. So if we maybe didn't include something in a recording, but we went into that screen, we can now include it in our form. So I'm going to show you, first of all, how you would map this in Excel version, and then we'll shift to a form. So if I was going to create hundreds of records, I would just simply do a drag and drop from Excel. So what that's saying is my Excel user is going to input data into SAP. So we go in that direction. We could also go bi-directional. We could actually read data from a transaction to our Excel template. So we can go in either direction as we're creating these forms. We can do things like reading master data about maybe a customer or a vendor or a material. So that's the way you would do an Excel template. And just imagine we could add hundreds or thousands of new materials. In this case, I'm going to change that source. But what you have here is the runner file that would go to the end user. The end user would put their data in here and then submit it to SAP. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to create an electronic version of that. Now we're going to say the form builder or submitter will submit data to SAP. So I'm going to save this. All right, so now we're ready to approve this particular transaction. And the reason I say we need to approve the transaction is because a lot of times we build these transactions in a test environment just to make sure that they work according to our parameters. So what I'm doing is I'm just simply walking through an approval process for this transaction to take it from a test state. So maybe we start these transactions in a test environment, a development environment, and then we move them to a production environment. And that's really what I'm doing here. So I want to take this transaction. I'm going to select myself, again, as the approver of the script. All this can be managed, through that central environment. So that's really what we're doing. We're logging through that central environment to do the approval of this. And what happens, and the reason that we do this is because we really want to get that, again, to that production status. So now I'm going to open my script up, and as you see the workflow notification popping up down below, I'm going to open our script from Central because we want it in that production status. Because when it's in that production status, I can publish the web service. And that's what we really want to get. Remember, I need the web service in order to design and build my form and workflow. So we'll go ahead and publish that. And so my SAP or my Winshuttle license allows me to call the various SAP landscapes that I have available to me. So that's the nice thing about Winshuttle. If I have one, if I have security access to a landscape, I can use it. So here's that HTML link that it created, which is really nothing more than an electronic version of the transaction recording. Now I'm going to open Designer. As you recall, when I was kind of walking you through the flow a while ago, we record the transaction, it's stored in Central. Now I'm in Designer. I want to grab that web service. So I'm in Designer. I will look for my web service that we just created. And it's going to be probably the last one, logically. And we'll instantiate that recording. So look, this is the recording we just made. It looks much like the mapper. This is just an electronic web service version. I'll just use Designer to generate the info path form. Save it. Say OK. And now basically what I can do is either design or the form or the workflow. And I can do it in either order, either sequence. I kind of prefer to design the form first before I do the workflow. So let's launch InfoPath. And here we are in the InfoPath Designer. First thing I'm going to do is I'll give my form a name. And then I have a couple of things I need to do. I need to map the data source of the web service, those objects that we recorded, to my form. I need to add the Winshuttle controls. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. And I'm going to create a couple of views as I go through the process. Let's start with a data source. And so I have my recording, and I'm just going to take my fields in one lump sum here in this case. I'm going to grab those, and I'm going to copy them over here. So now I've created a view for, let's say, the material clerk. To that, I need to add Winshuttle controls. So there's a couple of controls. This process control I'm adding is really the control that allows me to publish that integrated workflow form to that SharePoint environment. All right, so I've created a view for my material clerk. I now want to create another view for my manager. I'll say OK. I'll copy in the original view, and now we'll change it just a bit. We'll alter it just a bit. First of all, I'm going to go back to my data source excuse me, and add the log field, because we want the manager to post to SAP, and then I'll add the control that will allow him to call the SAP web service. We'll define that control by saying we want to associate the control with that web service. Remember the recording of our transaction. So when I press this button on this form, I want you to post to SAP. And I'll apply that. I'll say OK. So basically what we've done is we have mapped our data source, our web service, our transaction recording to the form. We have added the controls that are necessary to do the publishing and calling of the web service, and we've created a couple of views. I'm finished with my design. I'll save it, close it, and now what I want to do is I want to take that form and I want to publish that form so that others in my organization can share it, can use it. So we'll say SharePoint 2007, and we'll publish it to this website that I was using a minute ago when we called up that end user example of the material create. So we're putting it in that same library. Now what it's asking me here is, do you want to associate the current workflow? So what we have is a blank template. And I'm going to say yes in this case, but I want to make a point here. And the point is I've located where I want my form to sit. And now because of that, I have access to any other form that's out there. So the point being, I can have forms, I can have workflow, and I can mix them and match them. I could create a new workflow for an existing form, or I could create a new form for an existing workflow. In this case, we're going to build a workflow from scratch. I've got my form published, so now I can build this integrated workflow. So the first thing I want to do is I've got the originator, and we'll call him the material clerk, and I've got really just the author of the process. So I want to add another role or another participant in this process, and we're going to call him the manager. And we will assign him to a particular approval group, and I'll say OK. So now I've got my originator, I've got my manager. You know, if you wanted to, you can always move, you know, these guys around. You could put my manager there. You know, if you wanted your author maybe at the bottom. We could have multiple, as you recall a minute ago when I brought up that graphical representation. You could see the different roles and participants. We had basic data, manager, sales, accounting, master data. So that is how we define them here, these roles, these swim lanes. So now what I need to do is I need to create a basic flow for this process. We're going to start here with the originator, the material clerk. We're going to send it to the manager for approval, and then he is either going to be able to approve it or reject it. We'll say here if he takes this route, we'll call this one approved. If he takes this route, we'll call this one rejected. And then maybe I'll add a couple of email notifications in here so that we'll send an email notification back to the originator. So let's say the process starts with the material clerk, goes to the manager, goes back if it's approved to the originator, and it does the same thing if it's rejected. So we could be much more elaborate in our design. We could have more participants in the process, but we could do things like escalation procedures. We could have loops to where If it's not approved, that it goes back to the prior step, and until they successfully complete their step, then it is not approved, and so forth. We also want to give the view that we created in the design of the form to the manager. So when the manager opens it up, the manager sees his view. So basically, I'm finished designing my workflow. I'll go ahead and publish my integrated workflow form. And now I can access that. I'll just do a simple refresh of this SharePoint site. And we'll start our workflow process. So this is kind of where we started the presentation in creating material. This time we created a new one. We'll open it. And we'll just start with creating a new material. So we'll say Industry Sector 2, and we'll give it a material type, and a base unit of measure, a material group. Remember, division was one that I later enabled after the recording. And we'll just put in all this basic data that is required for this transaction. Again, you design, as you're designing these forms and templates, you decide what is required. You can also make certain fields fixed values where you don't change them. Maybe your sales org or your company code doesn't change, or you don't want your end user to have to input that data as you're building these forms. And others are variable and allow the end user to input data. As soon as I've input my data into my material here, I'll route it along in the process. And now my manager, again, receives notification. Manager opens it up, and in this case, we can see a different view. We see the original fields, but now we also see the ability for the manager to call the web service that we published in transaction. Call that web service to pass this data and information along to SAP, and to hopefully successfully create that new material in SAP. And we did so. We might add our comments and approve it. And finally, ultimately, we've created our material, and we have our workflow audit trail here. The material creation and the steps along the process. So I think you would all agree that throughout this process, I mean, the ability to incorporate many functional areas of SAP, to easily record very non-programmatically, to graphically map to the form, and to easily create and design these forms and workflow, and simply publish those back to these SharePoint, this SharePoint central environment, so that our end users can easily access them, and then we can communicate with SAP. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to, I think, Teresa in this case. Teresa, is that correct? And
that is correct. Thank you, Bill.
Yes.
And at this time, I would like to go ahead and open the floor up for any questions that anyone may have out there. If you please provide your questions again in the chat window for the GoToWebinar, we can go ahead and get through these as quickly as possible. We have our first question, Bill. Is there an evaluation for the product available?
Yes, there is. So there is an evaluation license for transaction and query, and it's a desktop install, so that you can easily take the software, do some internal evaluation, and certainly can work with the adaptive team on building these scripts, and maybe do some independent testing.
And then actually you can generate, if anybody's interested in a transaction evaluation, Teresa at the end of this call will have the free complimentary evaluation key. So anybody on the call, if you're interested, just reach out to Teresa.
Perfect.
Perfect. Our next question is it possible to customize this screen to include more fields?
Absolutely. So you can add more fields to your form from both an SAP perspective. So if there were other objects that you wanted to incorporate, and in addition, there's also the ability to have non-SAP type fields or objects that you could collect data and store that data in that SharePoint database. So you can have both SAP and non-SAP objects embedded in these forms.
Perfect. Our next question is, what versions of SharePoint do I need?
Okay, so as I think maybe Nick mentioned earlier in the process, we are a Microsoft Gold certified partner, Winshuttle, and we do stay up to date with all the rollouts and the roadmap of Microsoft and supporting SharePoint both 2007 and 2010, as well as any of the other Microsoft products, the InfoPath. We have I would say we have users that are incorporating the Excel version even to older versions, maybe 03 or 07 versions of Excel as well.
Perfect. Next question is, how does this product differ from Duet of MS and SAP?
Okay, so Duet is a little bit different. It's a more of a, I would say, a more of a tactical approach to business processes, and I think Winshuttle is maybe more of a strategic approach. Although we're very good partners with Microsoft and have worked with Microsoft on some joint deployments of both. The Duet product, there are a few more technical requirements, software requirements that are associated with it, and it's a bit more of a programming approach to building the workflows, as opposed to, I would say, what you would say maybe a non-programmatic approach or graphical approach that we take, and certainly enabling. And we're really taking that native communication with SAP as we're producing the web service.
And Bill, our next question, I think you touched a little bit on it, but they asked, do we have a roadmap to work with SharePoint 2013?
There is a roadmap. I think that's something that we would, if there's a specific question, they can reach out to you directly, Teresa, and we can get that information. And generally, I think that's something that our marketing department can provide.
Okay. Our next question is, what happens if there is any problem saving the record in SAP?
So if there's an issue, okay, so maybe I'm going to step back and just take a stab and say, there's a couple of ways you could think about that. If it's a problem in saving the record when we're recording the transaction, then you'd want to address that error message. If it's something that happens when we create or run the script or we try to pass the web service, then that log message is going to be returned back to the form that maybe you have an incorrect material group, or your date field is in the wrong format, or something of that nature. But we have and we didn't really get too deep into it, but quite extensive error handling and error tracking capability that's built into the solution, as well as the ability to invoke validation. As you saw me earlier in the presentation, I can actually check the data. If there's anything missing or anything that's incorrect, then it's going to throw that error message back to me.
Okay, thank you. Next question, how does this work in the corporation governance structure?
How does it work? If you're, Yeah, I probably would need a bit more specific. I'm not sure if they're talking about in conjunction with a GRC type application. I'm not really exactly sure. Probably have to elaborate a little bit more on that one, Teresa.
Okay, we can circle back to the attendee. Next question, can it run strictly from the desktop?
Yes, so as Nick brought up that kind of solution map, what you can run from your desktop, from the developer side or the builder side, the transaction, query, and direct. That allows me to load data via transaction, extract data via query, and then also the direct allows me to leverage BAPIs to do the same sort of load via transaction. Also, the runner can work from the desktop. Now, the server and the foundation and the designer, the workflow, that is an enterprise deployment and would sit on a server, and you would have a SharePoint server as well, which would provide that access point to be able to store and build and submit forms and data files to SAP.
Okay, we've got two more questions here. Do you use the SharePoint task list, workflow, and document libraries for forms?
You know, it's just it's a separate site, but the same logical approach to what you have described here. So now we have SharePoint lists, we have SharePoint tasks, we have a SharePoint document library, but it's just set up in a specific site. So if you've already got SharePoint deployed, then really all we are is a separate site in your SharePoint deployment. And if you haven't, then you can leverage either the foundation, the free version of SharePoint, or the enterprise version, the paid-for version. There's really very little difference in the functionality with regards to Winshuttle requirements.
And Bill, our last question, can you use the forms and workflow for non-SAP applications?
You can use the forms and workflow for non-SAP applications. So you may just have generic forms that you want to collect data, documentation, and store them in a central repository. So you can just, I mean, the interaction that I showed you was really just taking that and enabling that web service within inside that form. So you can create forms without the web service. Or you could create forms with your own web services.
Okay. We'd like to thank everyone at this time for joining us on our call today. If there is any more additional questions that you may have, my contact information is on the screen with my phone number and also my email address. So you can feel free to contact me, and we'd be happy to circle back with you and assist you in any way that we can. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.